Hi, my name is David, and this is Random Writer Notes, Episode 2, What Writers Can Learn About Creating Sympathy for Your Protagonist from the Netflix original show, You. That is a really long title. Hopefully I can shorten that down to something a lot shorter. There will be spoilers for the show. This is your one and only warning. Just saying. Joe's a bad guy. He's the protagonist. But he's also a stalker and a murderer. And still there were times that I shamefully admit that I rooted for him. Why? That's the question I want to answer today. As writers, it's so important for our readers to root for our protagonists. And in You, there are some obstacles that the writer just overrides. Why? The answers make the antagonist worse than the protagonist. In this case, I'd say Guinevere Beck is the antagonist. And although she cheats on Joe at some point, the story requires you to like her to some degree, and so here's the key. Minor antagonists. Just like minor villains. In You, they carry the show by creating conflict and making Joe seem like the good guy. I'll explain. Within the first few episodes of the show, they introduce 4 minor villains. Yeah, I'll call them villains, fuck. You have Benji, Peach, the slimy teacher, you know the one, and Ron, the abusive next-door neighbor. With Benji and Peach, they're just plain unlikable. They're rich and entitled, and they look down on Joe, and you feel for him just a little. Joe's still a bad guy, though. Benji is that guy. Don't be that guy. He's obnoxious. He treats people like shit. He uses Beck, and he straight up got someone drunk and threw them in a pool, and they died. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really feel bad for the guy when he drank the peanut oil and died. I was like, okay. He was born into a wealthy family and owns his own business. Well, owned. And he couldn't recognize his own product if his life depended on it. And it literally did. Still couldn't figure it out. Peach Salinger. She's obnoxious and she keeps blackmail photos and videos of her friends. And she's actually in love with and more obsessed with Beck than maybe even Joe himself is. She knows Joe's a bad guy, and she's suspicious of him, and she's right, and we don't side with her right away. Why? Because the angle she takes when talking about him with Beck is that he's too poor for her, and that makes her just instantly unlikable. Most of us regular folk are just like, hey. Then we have the slimy teacher. Beck needed someone to have conflict with while Joe deals with Benji early on, so we get the slimy teacher. He seemingly has control over Beck's collegiate career, and he uses that power to make sexual advances on her. We hate him more than Joe this early in the story, but Joe's still bad. He's a stalker and a murderer. Joe is bad. And then we have Ron, the abusive neighbor. He beats his girlfriend while her son waits outside the apartment on the stairs. We immediately don't like Ron, but Joe is still bad. But I like Joe better than I liked Ron. Ron is physically bigger and stronger than Joe, and he uses that to beat the shit out of Joe. And his gut tells him that Joe's a creep, that Joe's a bad guy, and his instincts tell him that. And we don't really care. He's right, but we still don't like him because he's a drunk who beats his girlfriend. So we're not exactly rooting for the guy. The slimy teacher's brushed off pretty quick. Benji's indirectly killed by Joe. Peach is straight up murdered by Joe. She was trying to shoot him, but we know how that worked out. And Ron is also murdered by Joe. And after we're past those 4 minor villains, then we go into what I like to call the third act of the show. Joe sort of faces off with John Stamos, aka Dr. Nikki. And let's be real, if your girlfriend's therapist is John Stamos, guess what? She's cheating. Dr. Nikki's murder isn't a physical one, it's more of a social murder. His life is forever ruined and will never be the same. And we don't feel too bad because Nikki was sleeping with Beck while she was still Joe's girlfriend. But Joe's still bad. The showrunner uses these minor villains to get us to the final climactic moment of the show, where Guinevere Beck faces off with Joe. She cheated, it's one bad quality, but ultimately he captures her and murders her. Joe's the bad guy, clearly. But, and this is a big but, the writer's job here was to get us to follow along until the end. And they succeeded. So what I learned from You is how to use minor villains to push the story along to get to that final showdown. You can't always have your protagonist and your antagonist face off every scene or every chapter. So, one useful tool is to have these minor villains pop up, and they can drive the conflict. They can be cannon fodder. You can throw them in there whenever. And one really useful tool is to make them unlikable. With your actual antagonist, you have to have some kind of redeeming quality or something about them to where you can see where they're coming from. Think of like a Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones. Like, you understand their motive. But for the minor villains, they don't need a redeeming quality. They don't need... They could be obnoxious, they could be rude, they could be terrible, because they're only going to be in the story for a short time and just serve a small purpose. To just push the story along just a bit. Just enough. That's what I learned, and I hope you learned something too. Until next time, later. This actually does make a difference.
Really?
Yeah. You can hear it in the sound. It doesn't echo as much.